Hello everyone, and welcome to the northern banks of the Potomac River. And it is here on these ancient eroded banks where our video today will take place. We are currently heading over the bridge into Brunswick, Maryland, where we shall be spending the entire day train spotting. However, this isn't just a regular day of train spotting. On the date of filming, the weekend of November 10th, 2024, marks a historical event for Amtrak, America's national passenger rail carrier. And on this weekend of November 10th, marks the 4 final runs of Amtrak's Capitol Limited service running from Washington D.C. to Chicago. And I invite you to come along with me as I showcase my entire day of chasing the final 2 Capitol Limiteds. Our day of adventure began at 11:20 when we arrived at Brunswick, Maryland, just in time to see the eastbound Capitol Limited. Brunswick itself is an up-and-rising town on the northern bank of the Potomac River, located in Frederick County, Maryland. It's currently home to around 8,000 or so inhabitants, and was originally established in 1787 by a man called Leonard Smith. The town's conception began when Mr. Smith laid out a tract of land very close to the German crossing ferry to allow for goods to pass through. This became incorporated as a small town, which he decided to name Berlin. After the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's mainline construction had reached Berlin, the little town saw a huge boom in economics, not to mention the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal that had been built there as well. The name was officially changed to Brunswick in 1890 and has stuck ever since. And the town still continues to see growth with the CSX freight rail yard located right next door and the affordable housing projects going into full effect. Anyway, now that I have finished explaining to you a little bit of the history behind this little town, let's move on to the main attraction, the Capitol Limited. Upon arriving, we still had an estimated 30 minutes to wait until the Capitol Limited got here. Right now, the number 30 Capitol Limited is running 9 minutes late and is scheduled to make a stop at Harper's Ferry at 11:37. It shall then depart Harper's Ferry at 11:42 and pass its way through Brunswick on its way to its next stop at Rockville, Maryland. So now, all there was left to do was wait. On the wrong side of the yard, apparently. For some reason, I thought that the 30 Capitol Limited went on the northern side of the yard, but it turned out that it actually went on the southern side of the yard, so yeah. I had a pretty big realization as soon as I heard those level crossings go off on the southern side. Luckily, I was able to make a mad dash for it and caught the Capitol Limited just in time. You can tell I barely made it by my poor camera placement and might need to move the camera a little bit forward, as the left pan would have been blocked by a sign. So what we just saw pass us by was the 29 Capitol Limited, the eastbound service running from Chicago to Washington, D.C. But if we plan to see the second to last Capitol Limited, that being the 29 Capitol Limited running from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, we're going to have to wait an additional 6 hours until it comes by. So we just decided to stick around the yard for a while to possibly see some switching operations, a couple of mixed traffic trains, an autorack train, and an empty coal train going westbound. At the moment, there's going to be a mixed traffic train coming by at 12:20 to get its cars switched out. And while we waited, I decided to go down trackside to see what sort of things I could see in the yard. Over there in the distance, we can see a couple of marked trains, including 2 MP36s and even a GP40. About 40 minutes later, a small switching operation began with a couple of GEVOs that seemed to be switching around a closed hopper train of some sort. Suddenly, the train in the back began to be shifted by a pair of unseen locomotives, likely to get it off the line for the mixed train to go by, and just to put those cars into the yard and to get ready for sorting. It was at this point when we decided to move back to the station parking lot to see the switching from a different angle. The rest of the switching continued to go normally. That was until I turned my head and realized that the mixed train had completely snuck up on me. I mean, I literally stood there for like 5 minutes and didn't notice a giant mile-long train right behind me. Anyway, the mixed waited until the train being switched was moved off of the right-of-way, waited some more, and then blew its horn, signifying its beginning of movement. But before the mixed train even got a chance to activate the level crossing, this man rode across the crossing on a penny farthing bike of all things. I totally didn't have to look that up before making this recording. Bruh. And out of the blue, here's a Union Pacific C-45 SH trailing behind a CSX ES-44. For real though, why is there a UP-GEVO in Maryland? The mixed train seemed to be restricted to a much slower speed while entering the yard, since it took about 10 minutes for the entire train to pass. And while we wait for the mixed train to pass and for us to get on with our day chasing the Capitol Limited, let's talk a little bit more about the history of the Capitol Limited itself. But in order to truly understand the roots of the Capitol Limited, we're going to have to start not with the Baltimore and Ohio, but instead with the one and only Pennsylvania Railroad. And to understand it even further, we're going to have to go much farther back than 1923, all the way back to June 15th, 1887. It was on that date when the Pennsylvania Railroad established its very own Pennsylvania Limited, running from New York to Chicago, thus opening up the vast New York to Chicago market. And the reason for the vastness of this market is because at the time, New York and Chicago were both of the most economically profound cities in the United States. So it's safe to say that the Pennsy once again started us off with an absolute banger. But then, just like in real life, you can't have everything all to yourself. There will always be someone trying to one-up you. And that came in the form of none other than Pensy's main rival, the New York Central, and their brand new 20th Century Limited running from New York to Chicago.
Give me that.
What?
Give me that.
Broadway Limited.
Another big event in the history of this market was when the Pennsy decided to rename their Pennsylvania Limited to the Broadway Limited to avoid confusion with another train with a similar name. Now we can finally get to the B&O and the Capitol Limited. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, being older than both the Pennsylvania and the New York Central Railroads, got a little bit jealous of their success in the New York to Chicago market. Now do note that the B&O did not simply create the Capitol Limited out of jealousy. I just used that word for the sake of this YouTube video. So anyway, the Capitol Limited had its inaugural run on May 12, 1923, when it ran from New York down to Washington D.C, then made its way up the Potomac River to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio, and then finally terminating in Chicago, Illinois. Little did everybody know, this line would not mean all sunshine and rainbows for the B&O. For starters, the B&O did not own any tracks leading directly into New York City, meaning that they had to use the CRNJ in conjunction with a ferry across the Hudson River just to get into Manhattan. Not to mention that the route itself was also quite indirect, as it had to go over many steep grades just to get through the Alleghenies. And despite all these issues, the B&O more than made up for all of them with the sheer luxuriousness of this train, with the consist featuring several Pullman sleeping cars, dining cars, and even a dome car. This train was definitely the peak of 1920s luxury rail travel. But then came World War II, perhaps one of the darkest times in recent human history. This meant that the need for passenger passenger trains was very little, and the Capitol Limited became very little utilized. Fortunately, in 1945, the war ended with a boom, which then sparked another boom, a post-war boom. The post-war boom allowed much economic growth for all companies around the world, especially for the railroads. Although this was short-lived for the railroads because of the rise of planes and automobiles. Nevertheless, rail travel is still stuck as a main form of transportation all around the world. But there was another, much larger factor that aided most of the railroads of the time to stick around, and that was dieselization, baby! Let's go! Diesel-electric motive power is on the rise, and steam power is out of here. The rail fans are outraged, Alfred Perlman is going crazy, and EMD is cooking harder than Gordon Ramsay.
That's spot on.
Well, looks like thanks to diesels, railroads are gonna stick around in the United States. Wait, what's that? Oh, they still failed? Every single last one of them? Oh yeah, forgot about that part. Yeah, the 1960s were not a very good time to be a railroad anywhere in the world, unless you're French or Japanese, cause you actually care about good rail transportation, unlike America. And so, like just about every other railroad in the United States, the B&O slowly started to dissolve. So that meant that on April 30th, 1971, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad would run for the very last time the Capitol Limited. Now, if you are even remotely familiar with American rail history, you will know that 1971 was a pretty big year for railroads. It is because on that year, the government finally realized that passenger rail was not the same place where it was 20 years ago. So as a last-ditch effort, the government created the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970. This would effectively combine all major transcontinental rail carriers into two big government-controlled corporate entities. These two nationalized companies would become known as Amtrak for passenger carrying and Conrail for freight carrying. Although Conrail would cease operation in the mid-90s, Amtrak still continues to service America to this day. Although saying that it was smooth sailing right from the very beginning would be one of the biggest lies I've ever said. At first, Amtrak seemed like it would just become another failed railroad similar to how Penn Central failed. They were constantly overwhelmed with old, aging, and rundown rail equipment, most of it dating back to the 1950s. There was also the added bonus of almost every new locomotive that Amtrak would order would just randomly fly off the rails 3 months into its service life, or ride so roughly that the FRA will start giving you the biggest side eyes you've ever seen. Of course, in 1976, Amtrak got its savior locomotive in the form of the almighty F40PH. Yeah, this is the most overrated locomotive of all time. There! I said it, okay? Sue me! Anyway, wait, where's the Capitol Limited in all of this? Oh yeah, let's skip ahead to 1981, when Amtrak decided to resurrect the old line and bring the Capitol Limited back into revenue service. This new and improved line, now operated by Amtrak, would completely do away with the entire New York to DC segment and only keep the DC to Chicago leg. Henceforth, the Capitol Limited was a great steady source of income for Amtrak, running all the way through the turn of the century and Amtrak's great rebranding in 2000, all the way up until present day. Moving forward to the year 2024, when Amtrak announced that it will be beginning its East River Tunnel rehabilitation project in New York. And as of the making of this video, the project has already pretty much began and is expected to last until 2027. However, due to this restoration project commencing, two existing Amtrak lines would need to see some changes. And these two routes were the Silver Star running from New York to Miami and the Capitol Limited. So on November 11th, 2024, both of these services would run for the very last time and officially combine into one direct train running from Miami to Chicago, which would become known as the Floridian. And oddly enough, the name Floridian actually derives from a previous Amtrak train with the same name, a similar route, but was discontinued in 1979. And so, from Manhattan to DC, to the mountains to the sea, the Capitol Limited has had a crazy roller coaster of events throughout its 101 years of life. And although the Capitol has now been replaced by the Floridian, every website I have checked has said that the Capitol Limited is only temporarily being replaced, so who knows, maybe in 2027 we shall once again see the mighty Capitol Limited grace the rails once again. now that the mixed train has passed, we're going to stay in Brunswick a little while longer just to see the westbound Harper train headed to the Millville Quarry and the eastbound Autorack train, which should be coming by soon after. Then we'll hop back into our car and break for lunch. By now, it was already 1 o'clock, so it's just about time we go and get some food. And to get said food, we decided to go over to the Route 657 Cafe in Luckettsville, where I saw this viral Lego candy and got some pretty scrumptious food myself. But anyway, now that we have successfully replenished our food supply, it was time to go and see the second to last Capitol Limited. But to do so, we are not going to be going back to Brunswick Yard, but instead, we're going to be traveling 10 minutes westward over to Harper's Ferry. It is among the most popular places to spot the Capitol Limited along its route, so it only seems fit that Harper's Ferry should be the place where we shall see the last Capitol Limited. And upon arriving, we saw this group of two absolute daredevil parasailers coming within 100 feet of the station and flying all over, doing crazy maneuvers around the entire area. And while waiting for the 29 Capitol Limited to arrive, I ran into fellow YouTuber Brandino's Trains. I had a great time talking to him, and I highly recommend you go check out his video he made on the last Capitol Limited as well. And there we can see, going into the tunnel, a CSX Autorack train set to roar past us in just a couple minutes. "15 minutes later, the moment of truth finally arrived. The final 29 Capitol Limited to ever run emerged from the tunnel, headed by Siemens ALC 42 number 343, and pulled into the station at 4:10, 4 minutes early. The Charger stood idling for a little while before moving forward slightly to load the rest of the train, as the track 2 side of the station is much shorter and requires the train to pull forward to load the rest of it. And 5 minutes later, the Charger sounded its horn and the 29 Capitol Limited pulled out of Harper's Ferry Station one last time.